hit my record so that we're recording. This all happened so quickly now. Back in the day, day being 2020.
2 years ago, exactly.
Back in the day. The day that you all are going to talk about is really back in the day. Yeah. But 2020, it's just like, oh, with Facebook, it was, I would sweat bullets thinking, is Facebook going to connect? It's just,
it didn't always connect. It was awful. You'd have to transfer to like Insta Live or something. It was a nightmare.
It was a nightmare. So thank you, Facebook, and thank you, Zoom, for getting together and making this seamless now, because I still love doing these events because we get to host people like Natalie Jenner, who's joining us from, where are you calling it from?
Near Toronto, outside of Toronto, Ontario, Canada.
Okay. And then Caroline is joining us all the way from
Melbourne in Australia.
So there is no chance, I'm saying virtually no chance, virtually, pun intended, that these two ladies would be in La Jolla, San Diego at the same time to have this conversation. I mean, there were the planets and everything would have to align in some miraculous way to make that happen. So I love doing the virtual events because of this reason.
Yeah.
So thank you both for being here. It's going to be such a great conversation. I can't wait. Let me do a little housekeeping before we get started. So we got where the authors and Caroline are from, and Natalie. Like I said, we're located in La Jolla, San Diego, California. So hopefully we have people joining us from all over the world on this. Unfortunately, we don't ship all over the world though. So if you're joining us from inside the United States, I'm going to put a link on how to click to Natalie's new book called The Bloomsbury Girls right there. And Natalie has generously offered to donate $5 per copy sold during this event to Caroline's foundation, which is the Jane Austen Literacy Foundation. So, Natalie, thank you for your generosity on that. I know that right, Caroline? So that's absolutely such a great thing. So I'll be putting that into the chat on Facebook. If you're watching this on YouTube later, there's not going to be any live action that you're going to see, but buy the book from us. Natalie will still probably, we'll get it all figured out. She'll honor it. So
if it's done before the weekend, we're good.
We're good. So I think we're all good with that. Also in that comment section on Facebook, we would love to have questions. So if you have questions for Natalie or Caroline, go ahead and put those in. They're going to chat for about 35-ish minutes, and then I'll come back in with any questions that you all might have in the audience. So with that, without further ado, let me introduce these wonderful women, and I will get off of this screen. So Natalie Jenner is the author of the instant international bestseller, The Jane Austen Society, right up there it is, which was also a USA Today and #1 national bestseller and has been sold for translation in 20 countries. Born in England and raised in Canada, Natalie has been a corporate lawyer, career coach, and most recently, and dear to our hearts, an independent bookstore owner in Oakville, Ontario, where she lives with her family and 2 rescue dogs. Love that you got the rescue dogs there. Like I said, we were here to talk about the Bloomsbury Girls, but I have a feeling we're going to have some Jane Austen Society chat going on. So, because joining her is Caroline Jane Knight. Caroline shares more than Jane Austen's name and DNA. She is the last of Jane's nieces to grow up in Chawton House in the south of England on the family's ancestral estate, where her 5th great aunt lived, wrote, and published her most famous works. After a highly successful career in business, Caroline founded the Jane Austen Literacy Foundation in 2014, a not-for-profit organization run entirely by volunteers supporting literacy in developing communities. She published her memoir, Jane and Me, My Austen Heritage, there it is right there, in 2017, to share her extraordinary story, and speaks to Jane Austen literacy and business events around the world. She now, like she said, lives in Melbourne with her husband, and in between running her business and the foundation, can often be found in her art studio. Love to see some of the art too. Ladies, have a great conversation. We'll see you in a little bit.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you. And Natalie, congratulations. I know that the Bloomsbury Girls was published yesterday.
Yes.
Very exciting. Very exciting.
Thank you. Yeah, it's just, I just love being able to say the author of 2 books. There's nothing more fascinating to me to get published in middle age, but then to be able to do it again, it's quite good fortune. Very happy. Yeah.
And obviously this is your second book with the Jane Austen Society, instead of being your first, which has been extraordinarily successful. I mean, really successful, hasn't it?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
20 languages.
21, and it's been it keeps getting sold. It's been optioned for film and TV, so it has long legs, as they say. And what's wonderful about that is I get to keep talking about it, and I keep interacting with those characters imaginatively, and that kind of, I think, was part of why I wanted to write another book with Bloomsbury Girls. Was I wasn't quite done with those 8 main characters from the Jane Austen Society.
And Bloomsbury Girls is set slightly later, isn't it, in 1950?
Yes, it's set 5 years later. And basically what happened was one of the 8 main characters, Evie Stone, she's the former servant girl at your fictional version of your family's ancestral home of Chawton House, Chawton Estate. And she will end up having a new life alluded to at the end of the Jane Austen Society. And then I pick it up three years later. And the Bloomsbury Girls is basically set in a bookshop in London in 1950, starting right on January 2nd. Evie is foiled by an academic rival, has to pivot, figures out she's going to go take a job with a bookshop, because there wasn't much that women in those days really, professionally could do. And she joins this bookshop where the women employees are very unhappy with all the male managers and department heads. And there's a battle of the sexes raging, and she gets embroiled in that. And so it's a brand new book. It's like a companion book to the Jane Austen Society. It can stand on its own. You don't need to have read the Jane Austen Society, although I think we both would like that people did.
Absolutely. And Jane Austen Society, as I know that I've sort of said to you before, I mean, obviously for me, having a novel and such a good novel that's set in my childhood home of Chawton is quite a bizarre reading experience, because you have absolutely captured. And it's funny because obviously, even though Frances Knight isn't real, and I appreciate you've obviously created my family in Chawton House, but by using fictional characters, and obviously I understand why you've done that. But for me, actually, Frances has become an ancestor of mine. It's strange.
Oh, that's going to make me cry. Don't say that.
Wow. She has become an ancestor.
Oh.
And in the Jane Austen Society, when you're writing about, her sitting on a particular window seat and so she could see the driveway to see who was coming, or sitting, and overlooking the courtyard. I mean, it just made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, because that's exactly what I did as a child. And actually, as I said, having a fictional novel, written with that sort of detail in my childhood home, as I said, absolutely extraordinary. And I know that when we first met,
I was so nervous. You reached out to me. You reached out to me, and I was like, "Oh, here, I'm in for it." I was like, "There's gonna be like a night family, like on the Zoom." Like, cause I was so like, "What have I done?" You were just so sweet. You were just reaching out.
It's something also, as I sort of have also said before. I mean, right from the off, when I very much threw myself back into the Jane Austen community in 2014, obviously for the foundation. It became clear very, very quickly that if I was going to be touchy or upset about what people did with Jane Austen, her work, my family, our legacy, I was going to spend my entire life upset, wasn't I, really? Because I mean, It is just out there.
It's too big.
So I always approach these things with an absolute open mind. And if things aren't for me, they're just not for me, but they're for someone, and someone will be enjoying it. And so I just don't. But obviously, so I always approach things with an open mind. But as I said, the Jane Austen Society, I loved it. I really did. And I know that I actually would have got something personal out of it. But I think for anybody, you did a really good job of actually bringing Chawton House to life as a family home, because obviously now it's a public building, isn't it? And it has a very different feel and atmosphere to a family home. And I thought you did a wonderful job, as I said, it absolutely.
Well, what's really interesting is that when you think about it, and like, thank you so much for saying that. And I very much appreciated when you reached out to me. You were so friendly, so open, so supportive and encouraging, and just so relaxed about it. And it was a wonderful experience for me as an author, because I was inspired with the Jane Austen Society. A huge part of it was your book, Jane and Me. So it's ironic to me that the book that you wrote, your memoir of growing up in Chawton House, was what I bought in the gift shop on my trip to Chawton House. I tuck it in my suitcase, I bring it home, I'm reading it in Oakville, Ontario, Canada. And I'm reading about how your mother on Sundays, I think you guys, like, she was running a little bit of a tea room.
A grandmother.
On Sunday afternoons, your grandmother. And that also, I think it was your book, Jane and Me, where I correct me if I'm wrong, but you do describe the heraldry, the stained glass.
Yes. Yep.
And that stuck in my mind as well, as someone growing up in a house where hundreds of years of family ancestry is literally in the windows, right? Looking down to the courtyard. And those moments in your memoir were what lit my imaginative spark and led to the Jane Austen Society, along with a few other books. But yours was one of the pivotal ones, because yours was the one that made me see the house as a family home, separate from the legacy of your incredible ancestor, right? And that was what enabled, I think, my fictional Knight family to come to life, was the memories that you shared of growing up there. And so it's so interesting to me that you've enjoyed the book that was inspired by your book. Like, it's very circular.
It's probably also because you're covering you know, the mid-40s, 1940s. Well, obviously that's an era that I wasn't alive for. So I actually don't have a mental picture of that. I mean, of course you create one yourself, don't you? But it's very scant. I haven't actually, you know, I can't put any flesh around that sort of imagination of what it might have been there. Yeah. And of course, I appreciate, as I said, yours was fictional with fictional Knight family members, but it still actually did paint actually a lot bigger picture of that era than I'd ever had in my mind, which was actually, as I said, it was very rewarding. And one of the things that you also have in the Jane Austen Society, and I know it flows through into Bloomsbury Girls, is this focus on our family library.
Yes.
And family library in Chawton House. So, you know, there was a room called the library, and it was my grandparents. They used it as their sitting room. It was absolutely the heart of our home, because my grandparents, who you know, were the king and queen to me, you know, it was their sitting room, but also because in that room were the personalities of all of my ancestors, because their choice of books and the design of their book plates tells you a lot. Whereas a portrait is actually very much the style of the day. You don't get much from a portrait really, but from books and knowing, obviously the book plates tell you which books, that is actually an incredible insight in, or a little window, isn't it?
Yeah.
Into what people were interested in. So for me, it was, I mean, absolutely the heart of our family was the library. And you very much, you know, so that's very strong in Jane Austen Society. And I know it is in Bloomsbury Girls as well. Was that always the plan?
No, I never thought I was going to write again. So when I wrote the Jane Austen Society, I wrote it for myself. I wrote it for my husband. I had a difficult time with his health. And it was my husband that said, you know, I think you have something here. I hate to tell you, I think you're going to have to go back to trying to get published, which I'd given up for 10 years. And when I wrote the Jane Austen Society and it came to its wondrous thud at the end, I really thought I was done with those characters. When I thought about writing again, it was right around the time the Jane Austen Society was coming out. And I think I was talking about my characters so much. I was starting to really miss them again. And I said to my agent, you know, maybe I'll follow Evie into it like a bookshop. And they asked me to do a pitch. So they asked for a small sort of sample and a synopsis, just to give the publisher, just to see if they would buy basically a second book based on that. And I looked back at the outline, Carolyn, and I noticed that I had talked about Evie joining this bookshop and the raging battle of the sexes going on, but I didn't know what was going to happen yet. And I didn't know that the library at Chawton House was going to factor in at all. I thought she would just maybe trip across an old rare book of some kind. So while I'm writing, I remember that very first prologue. I start writing in the second paragraph, no less, about your family's library. And I was like, what am I doing? And I realized that there had to be a connection there. And what's really interesting is I still didn't know as I was writing it that the book she's going to end up looking for was in that library. But I planted an Easter egg for myself as a writer in mentioning the Knight Family Library on the first page of the book. And later on in the book, and it's not giving away too much, there's a moment where you realize there's a line where the narrative voice says, she had come to the bookshop for another reason all along. And as I typed those words was when I realized, oh, she's looking for something that got missed at the Chawton House Library, and she knows it's valuable and nobody else does, and she's trying to find it. And that just all kind of clicked in. So it was a very, very intuitive and part of the writing process. So I had not intended that your family library would continue on in my imagination, but boy, did it. It was so much fun.
And when you visited Chawton and you visited the library, did you have a sense, although of course the Knight family collection might not have been in the same room when you were there, I was going to say, did you have any sense of imagining which books Jane would have?
I think that's what I always do is when I go. I think what us fans do when we go to where you grew up, in your home that you grew up in, I think you're trying to travel in her footsteps. I think you're trying to feel as close to Jane Austen as possible. At least I am. And when I'm walking through the house, or I did get permission to go into the reading room on the main floor there, so you can go in and you can see the collection, but I understand there's a lot of books in the vault in the basement as well, right? But everything I do when I'm there is trying to just feel as close to this woman that I worship and this genius as much as possible. So absolutely, I'm looking at everything through her eye.
It's interesting you talk about Battle of the Sexes, because when I was a child, when you're a kid, you obviously just accept what you grow up with, don't you? And I, of course, grew up in this incredible home, incredible estate. But by this point, the family were broke. I mean, the money had run out in the 1940s and 50s. It was, and as a child, you're not really aware of that sort of detail, are you? And I remember scouring our family library for copies of Jane Austen's novels. And I obviously grew up in a family that historically is very male led in terms of, the inheritors of the estates, and the history is very male led. And I remember as a kid not being able to find Jane Austen's books in that library and being furious and such a sense of, being Jane Austen isn't enough, if you know what I mean, to kind of make it into the family archives.
That's hilarious. They're at Sotheby's in the British Library, but you do you. That's hilarious.
Exactly.
I love that.
So I remember being very, very, as I said, just thinking, not angry at my individual family members. Yeah. I just mean at the whole, the whole sort of culture. Obviously, as an adult, of course, I have since discovered and now know that, of course, they were there, but they were sold. Yeah. Things of value were sold along the way to pay the bills and maintain the estate. And thankfully, a first edition of the first, and I'm going to forget the name now, but a first edition, the first time Jane's books were actually released as a complete set.
Yes.
And for some reason, my mind's blanking.
1932, was it Robert or Richard Bentley? Robert.
Yes, Bentley. Thank you.
Bentley. Yeah, the Bentley edition.
But in 2017, which was obviously the 200-year anniversary of her death, January 2017, a set of the first edition Bentleys turned up in a private collection in America with our family bookplate in the front, which was just, so they were there and they've been gifted back to the house. So the set is now back in the house. But as I said, when I was a child, I was very conscious of the male-female battle of the sexes that went on in books, as I say, and actually believed that Jane's books hadn't made it, which of course wasn't true.
And which is so fascinating, because actually with the family history, up to the adoption of Jane Austen's brother, was it Elizabeth Knight, was actually head of the estate, I believe, at one point. There was a woman that headed the estate at one point.
Thomas and Catherine. Thomas and Catherine adopted. There was no legal adoption, but adopted Edward.
But I think there was an earlier ancestor, and I find it really fascinating that was possible. And it's actually one of the themes that you pick up if you really immerse yourself in Jane Austen the way I did. One of the themes you pick up is the wealthy widow, the wealthy widow, or the wealthy woman who will not marry, because if she marries again or at all, she will lose her property. It will become the property of her husband. And that is something that it's so hard for us today to understand. And ironically, when I was writing the Jane Austen Society, it was exactly 4 years ago next week that I started to type the first words. He lay back on the old stone wall. And I had just watched a PBS Masterpiece Theater America production involving Little Women. And they did a documentary about the preservation of the house that Louisa May Alcott had lived in at the end of her life with some of her sisters. And it was her sister's sons who had donated all the furniture, et cetera, to a consortium of women in Concord, Massachusetts in around 1900. And they wanted to save the house, the way the Jane Austen Society wanted to save the cottage, right? And they wanted to save the house, and they literally couldn't incorporate as women. So they had to get their husbands.
Oh, you mean
in 1900?
Organization, right?
They had to get their husbands to incorporate a charity so that they could. Yeah, so it's fascinating. And one of the reasons with my books, it's not so much men versus women for me ever. I love men. Some of my favorite characters in my books are the male characters, Dr. Gray in the Jane Austen Society and Adam in particular. And in my new book, Lord Baskin and Ash, who's the entomologist and immigrant from India who's working in the science department. And by the end of the Bloomsbury Girls, I would give Ash and Lord Baskin anything they wanted. I love them so much. But what it's really about is who has agency to go after the life that they want. In each of these books, there's a lot about we're given sometimes really bad luck on a plate or bad circumstances, and what are the qualities that will help us have a running shot at overcoming those, and what do you need to foster both in yourselves but through friendship and community to overcome those sorts of hurdles. And it's not specific to gender, it's more about being disenfranchised or powerless or in pain, post-trauma, and being in a state where you can't live the life that you thought you were going to live. And how do you change that? What is the beginning to change? And for some people, it's as small as reading a book like by Jane Austen. And for other people, it's as simple as connecting over Zoom with someone for the first time, or having a cup of tea with a friend or a neighbor that you haven't seen in a while. It can be a small moment in life, but it has to be a moment of risk and openness. One of the reasons I like talking to you so much, you're so open. And I feel that openness is what increases serendipity in life. And one of the themes of my books, I think, is that, we can't control things, but we can increase our chance of luck happening. And I think that serendipity and luck happen more the more open you are to everything and the more curious you are about everything. And I think Jane Austen knew that too.
And I think, if you don't mind me saying, obviously knowing your personal story, what you've just described there is very much, I'm sure, the journey that you've had to go through, knowing that your husband, has got an illness and that neither of your lives is going to be.
That's right.
What you thought it was going to be. So
Yeah.
I know that's been, so you've obviously, which is wonderful, isn't it? When that's where the best art comes from, isn't it? Is from the reality of raw emotion.
I think that's why the Jane Austen Society got published. And I think it's when I wrote Bloomsbury Girls, I was stuck at home. I wrote the entire first draft of Bloomsbury Girls in the first wave of the pandemic. So May until September of 2020. And I never left my house once because my husband has lung disease and he's at the highest risk for severe COVID. And I left once to get a routine mammogram. That was it. I was like, woo. So I wrote this book in a time of tremendous sort of isolation, but on the other hand, massive global connection with people and readers around the world because the Jane Austen Society had come out that May. And I wrote the second book as well, coming from a place of, I think, wanting to find joy as much as possible under the circumstances. Where do you find the joy? Because it's today. You got your day. The world gave you another day. Where are you going to find your joy? And for me, it was writing about these characters in this bookshop. And man, I had fun. I had so much fun. I really hope it shows on the page when people read it. I was full of laughter and smiles while I wrote this book. It's lighter than the Jane Austen Society. It was a time when I was in a complex emotional state because we were stuck at home, and yet I was becoming weirdly a best-selling writer. Very late in life, and so it was a kind of an odd topsy-turvy experience. And I was a little high on life. I was in a good place. It was quite wonderful despite the circumstances. I hope that shows on the page.
And you say it's lighter than the Jane Austen Society, but I have to say, as a reader of the Jane Austen Society, I obviously understand because we've talked, obviously, what was going on in your life and why you were in Chawton and sort of what was behind that. But that doesn't come through, if you know what I mean. That doesn't translate into a reading experience that carries that sort of.
I'm glad
it doesn't at all. No, it doesn't at all. No. It's an extremely enjoyable read. Absolutely. And as I said, it's I think often, well, it is, isn't it? In all sorts of art, as I said, when it's coming from a genuine.
I think that's it, heartfelt, like real. Exactly. I think you're absolutely right, Carolyn. I wanted to ask you actually, you might have been planning to ask me this, but why, as someone, I read a lot of older literature and classics. Why do you think that your great aunt, why do you think she continues to inspire us so much, and she has lived on the way she has? Do you have a theory?
Well, my response to that is actually based on So I've done, I mean, you know, since 2014, I've done a lot of speaking events, so hundreds. So I have spoken to face-to-face and met thousands of Jane Austen fans, appreciators. And so from speaking to those, and at every event I go to and every event I speak at, there's always, and you know, you do a similar sort of thing, and you might be doing a book signing afterwards, and you've got the people that obviously come quickly to leave, but there's always a few people that sort of want to hang on because they want to talk more at the end. And so those people that are sort of most ardent fans, if you like, it's not unusual at all for somebody to burst into tears.
Yeah.
That's not an unusual response, and that's not to me. I mean, I know it's not. I mean, yes, I'm, you know, good at telling the story and good at engaging people, but it's not me that they're responding to. Mm-hmm. It's the fact that, and when I talk to those people, and I always ask people, you know, where their relationship with Jane Austen comes from, you know, where did that start? And there's a very common theme, actually, is that people were at a moment in their lives that for whatever reason was quite challenging, and it could be you know, parents split up when they're in the mid-teens, it could be, yes, you know, a partner dying or whatever it may be, or obviously, you know, you know, significant illness, and at that point, either through serendipity, as you said, or actually because an aunt or a sister or somebody put a copy of usually Pride and Prejudice in their hands and said, read this.
This will make you smile. Yeah.
And there is just something about Jane's. I mean, obviously I can talk, you know, I could talk in detail about the genius of her writing and actually what she's, you know, but, you know, the depth and richness of that. But the outcome of it is that she connects with people. It's like her writing is a comfort blanket.
Yeah, absolutely.
Comfort blanket. And I think that people, if they've made that connection, if she's been their comfort blanket at a certain moment in their life, they never forget that. No. That never goes away, that sort of connection. And so for people, she's as good as a living, you know, she's one of their best friends.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, like kind of going back to why did I go to Chawton? You know, I wanted to walk in her footsteps. I wanted to feel as close to her as possible because I had read so many books about her at this point. I had immersed myself in sort of self-study. Recreational research is all I can call it. And I wanted to keep staying near her because it just made me feel better. It made me feel safer, happier, comforted. And when I was writing the Jane Austen Society, as with Bloomsbury Girls, both experiences as a writer for me of fiction is that I get to go into an imaginative world and create friends and people that I can explore things I'm interested in. And with the Jane Austen Society, that was, you know, obviously exploring Jane and what it is about Jane Austen that was giving each of these people a balm, basically, you know, in a difficult time in life. And it's really interesting to me that books can do that, and that Jane Austen especially can do that for people. And I think with your literacy foundation that you started, was it 2014 that you said and one of the reasons that I think I had volunteered at a literacy center years ago when I was a young lawyer. You did not know this when you asked me to be an ambassador for the Literacy Foundation, and that was very synergy, like good synergy for me and fate. But one of the reasons I'm so passionate about books and literacy and opened my own bookshop, and now I write books, is because I always felt that books were the gateway to everything else, and that they lead to everything else. And that from a practical standpoint, literacy is critical as a function of education for people reaching their optimum selves that they can, and just to live a life of some sustenance. However, on a more, I guess, emotional level, books for me have always been, they can be your constant companion. They can be there for you in a breakup. If you're unemployed, if you're going through a difficult time in life, your books are there for you. They are tangible memory records for other earlier times in your life. I'm a big rereader. I love experiencing a book again that I enjoyed at a certain time in life and kind of putting myself back there. But I believe that books build empathy and understanding and connection between people like nothing else, because they're the art form that allows us to get into the mind of somebody else, into the consciousness of someone else. And they're so critical, which is one reason why I just want to say to everyone that's watching and that may watch afterwards on YouTube, is that one of the reasons I asked Caroline to do this event with me is because I do believe so strongly in the literacy work that her foundation does. And before we run out of time, I was hoping that you could just tell us a little bit of maybe some of the projects that the Literacy Foundation is.
Absolutely. So yes, so our mission is connecting through literacy, and really I set the foundation up because there is this just obviously enormous worldwide passion for Jane. And I mean, obviously she's got a phenomenal legacy anyway, but I just thought, wouldn't it be amazing to harness that and actually create something that was supporting literacy today for kids in developing communities? And that's really where my passion is. It really is. It's for, you know, children that we can actually make a material difference to their lives. You know, if otherwise they wouldn't have literacy. And as you said, it's not just, it's the practical side of life, but it's also the development of you as a human being, isn't it? So we do three things. One is we do lots of online literacy activities like writing competitions and things, you know, for our community. We run volunteer programs, so people can actually volunteer 2 hours a month of their time and actually directly give children feedback on their writing and things. So that's a very hands-on sort of helping literacy. And then we do lots of fundraising activities and obviously take donations. And because we're run by enormous hundreds of volunteers around the world, absolutely every single cent, penny, dollar is, you know, and it's spent on those literacy programs. So we support 5 different schools in India. We have done work in Syria, and Ghana, here for the remote Indigenous kids in Australia here, because the very remote ones have literacy issues. And we're obviously at the moment talking to various partners about Ukraine and really what can, you know, how we can.
No, it's wonderful.
But as I said, because we're volunteers, it means that every single penny that we raise is.
And also, I mean, you're virtual, like you're taking care of business and connecting is done through a lot of online sort of like resources and accessibility. So you can touch communities all over the world, and the volunteers can be everywhere. And I loved that idea that you were working with grassroots organizations that were on the ground in different places all over the world, and that your foundation could touch those communities was so impressive to me, along with the fact that it's entirely volunteer supported, and therefore all money raised is going to the actual work that's being done. I'm the luckiest person alive, really. I mean, to be, you know. No, I am, but we can have a time.
But one of the just amazing things about the Jane Austen community is it is a community of generously spirited writers, teachers, readers, you know, so it is a very willing audience in terms of getting involved in something, as I said, that is there for one reason.
So, I mean, for me, on a selfish, very egotistical or narcissistic level, the readers of my books are like the best human beings out there. I mean, I'm so grateful. I have the most wonderful readers. Is a very small, I was saying to someone today, small micro percentage of the people that love Jane Austen. And so I know exactly what you're talking about, because they are the most generous souls. It's really wonderful.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. So the Bloomsbury Girls, which I've got my copy here, which I'm very much looking forward to reading. You've got, are you intending to write another? I mean, I have a third
one. I actually am finishing it up. I'm finishing up right now. I've got a couple more chapters to write, and I decided to save them till after all the promotion was done, because you get a little tired. You get a little tired of yourself and your brain, and you kind of just need a break. But my husband just finished reading it last week, and basically it follows one of the new characters from Bloomsbury Girls 5 years forward, but this time to Rome, to Cinecittà, the movie studio, where this writer character, aspiring character, Vivian from the bookshop, is going to be a script doctor. She's going to be involved with a lot of expatriates and Americans, Brits, and Italians who are working on some films together. And so again, another experience during the pandemic where we've been largely at home, of being able to go to the other place in the world that I love besides England, which is Italy. So again, one of the great joys of being a writer. So I'm always a little half in Rome when I'm talking to people right now. It's really fun.
And in the Bloomsbury Girls, I know that you've included, you know, there's cameos of real writers from the 50s. How did you choose who to include?
They chose themselves. They just sort of like, I was telling the stories last night of how some of them, you know, showed up, but I would be watching a Netflix documentary, I would read a New Yorker article, and different famous people will just stay with me, and I'll start to kind of research them, and they take up real estate in my brain. And then when I was thinking about writing in 1950, I realized that a lot of the people I'd been paying attention to in my recreational research that I do as a historical fiction writer, I just read a lot of nonfiction. I realized that a lot of these characters were around at that time, traveling between London and the continent. And I think the biggest challenge for me, you wrote a memoir, the biggest challenge for me with historical fiction is staying within the real life goalposts. So if Samuel Beckett had been living in Bolivia in 1950, I wouldn't have put him where I did in my book, you know, like, so I really do try to pay attention to the nuts and bolts facts of people's lives, partly because it centers me as I write, it keeps a structure in place, but it's respectful. And this is interesting, thinking about what I've done with your family and completely fictionalizing them from 1860 onwards in the Jane Austen Society. It is respectful, I think, if you are actually writing about a real person, which is what I do differently with Bloomsbury Girls compared to the Jane Austen Society, is these people, Peggy Guggenheim, Daphne du Maurier, Sonia Orwell, they live real lives. They are really themselves fictionalized in my book. And so out of respect for that, I tried very hard to make sure that whoever showed up, it made sense that they do so. So by them introducing themselves to me through newspaper articles and movies and things, and making me interested in them and intrigued by them, they came forward to me. And then I was lucky I could organically fit them into my story. Really, I don't plot or outline. So as I'm writing, people would just show up. So I think I'd read about Daphne du Maurier and her friendship with Ellen Doubleday. And I wasn't really thinking too strategically about how Ellen will show up. I just knew she would show up at some point in the book. And I'll never forget, I'm writing and I have this wealthy American tourist, because where this area of England, of London is, Bloomsbury, you get a lot of tourists because of the great, you know, near West End and everything, and near the shows and near the museums. And there's a lot of American tourists. And I have this American tourist approach Vivian, one of the three main women characters, at the counter in the first sort of fifth of the book. And I don't know yet who she's going to be. And as she approaches and she asks her, is this book any good? And the minute she started to ask, I just went, oh, that's Ellen. And then I realized she's there. And I never knew exactly when she would show up. And then she was there. And then I knew she would help me introduce Daphne du Maurier, because I knew they were friends in real life. So they really do kind of just show up, and I kind of work with that. It's so much fun.
Amazing. So rather than actually planning out the whole book, just write and it comes to you.
Yeah. And also there's another scene. I think my favorite scene is when Daphne du Maurier has been invited by the women running the shop to hold a literary luncheon and be their guest speaker. And they're doing this at an hour where all the housewives can like go in the middle of their rounds to the greengrocer and the fishmonger, and their husbands won't know what they're up to. And they'll just like pop in, right? And we'll listen to Daphne du Maurier read from her newest book, her newest New York Times bestseller. And she's doing this reading and she's answering questions from a reporter. And all of a sudden a woman stands up and she mentions the name of a short story that in real life Daphne du Maurier had written, and it had gone missing for 70 years, and they only found it about 12 years ago. And I knew about this short story, but I did not know how it was going to fit in my book. And I'm writing the scene, and I have this character stand up, and she just goes, the doll. And Daphne du Maurier is like, how do you know about that? And then I remember going, oh, I know who this is. This is Sonia Orwell, because I had read that Sonia Orwell had worked as an assistant at a literary journal. And I knew I wanted her to maybe show up in the book, but I didn't know how that was going to happen. And then she stood up and she asked this question. And it turned out that it would have been one of the submitted stories that didn't get printed. And it's been lost for 13 years at that point, and mimicking kind of what would happen in real life. That's how it works for me as I write. Sorry to go on. It's endlessly fascinating to me.
It is. And I also think it's really interesting, the different challenges that there are around writing for. I mean, when I wrote my memoir, I've got the challenge of I'm actually writing about my real family. So I've got to, and for me, it was a balance of I wanted to give enough information so that people could actually, my family were alive, if you know what I mean, in the book, and you actually have a sense of who people were in some way. But equally, this is my memoir, and it was not my job to share, invade anyone's privacy in it. And so sort of, that was a delicate line. And also because you're also aware that my childhood memories might not be the same as everyone else's. And that doesn't mean to say that I changed, I didn't adapt them because of that, but you're aware of that. And as I said, and then you've obviously had the experience of, yes, writing fiction about a real family, i.e. my family. And now it's the challenge, isn't it, of writing about real historical people, as you said, such as writers, and then you've got your fiction characters. Yeah. And so actually there's all of these different with people, isn't there, and characters, there's different challenges, which is fascinating, actually.
Absolutely. And I think I think Julie's back. There she is.
Oh my goodness, we could go on because it's
we would.
I know, and I'm here for it. I am here for it. We can keep going, but it is so fascinating. You're right, Caroline. It's like, and Natalie, it must have been good in a way to go from writing completely fictional characters to a totally different challenge of writing real people in a fictionalized way. That had to have took.
It was really fun. Exactly. Yeah. It was the opposite experience. It required different skill set altogether. And as a former career coach, I'm all about growth. Like, you have to challenge yourself, right? You have to always try and do things a new way. That's what makes it fun. And so I loved having to figure this one out. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, I can imagine. And so we've got lots of fun comments coming in on Facebook, which is really fun. We've got Shelley from Pennsylvania said hi. So hi, Shelley, for joining in. And then Susie is saying she's excited to read the Bloomsbury Girls because she loved the Jane Austen Society. So we love that. And let's see, I think we got some questions coming up here. Okay. Signed copies we have. So I answered that one with you. So Natalie, this is from Shelley. If your book, and I was trying to get Shelley to tell us which book she was talking about, but we could do both. And this might get us into a who's the better Darcy conversation.
I'll always talk about that. I just talked about it this morning with my daughter.
Yeah. And so because actually what Shelley's asking is, if your book was turned into a film, what actors or actresses would you choose to be your characters and why?
Oh, this is so interesting to me. Yeah. So actually Richard Armitage could play everybody, and he actually does do the audiobook for the Jane Austen Society. Caroline can tell you about listening to that. But he inspired the voice of Dr. Gray as I actually wrote the book. He was in my head because I'd been watching North and South on a car trip to Virginia, and he just has the most resonant, emotive, wonderful, deep, rich voice. And so I remember he was very much in my mind. So when they asked me about the audiobook narrator, they suggested women, and I was like, has anyone thought of a man? And my agent was like, who would you? I was like, Richard Armitage. And they got him. It was so unbelievable, right? So they get Richard Armitage to do the audiobook. So he is my Dr. Gray, and he can pretty much play everybody because he has, including like the woman characters. But in the second book, Bloomsbury Girls, he was pretty much the inspiration for a character called Lord Jeremy Baskin. His family won the bookshop 100 years earlier in a card game, and he has this bookshop. He pops in. He's not very overly involved, but he pops in for a reason, which you find out as you read. And he's a wonderful, charismatic, compassionate character. And so that's who I sort of see between the two books, that same actor. And then Saoirse Ronan, who it was marvelous. Yeah, so marvelous as Jo in the Little Women movie that came out recently. She very much is my Evie. And if anyone's been watching Sanditon out there, and I'm on viewing number 2 with my daughter, there's a wonderful actress, and forgive me, I don't know her name, but she plays Lady Esther Babington. And she's, oh my goodness, that woman's extraordinary. And she is very much my Vivian in Bloomsbury Girls. So yeah, I actually will be putting a post up. I will be putting a post up of how I would cast my books.
I love it. So Caroline, do you get people when you have events and things telling you their favorite movie adaptation?
Oh, absolutely.
and the author?
Yes, of course. And usually it's Witch, Pride and Prejudice.
Right.
Whether it's 95 or 2005, I think was the other one, or something.
Yep.
Whenever the other one was. Yes.
Oh yeah, that's
the
quite the
usual debate.
controversy online.
Yes.
Yes.
People get very heated about those two.
They do.
It must be really fun to I mean, and it is so fascinating that, you know, you said 2017 was the 200th anniversary, is that correct, of her death?
Which is when I went.
Yeah.
That was when I went to England and went and spent a week in the village where she grew up, was because it was the 200th anniversary. It was 2017. And they had tons of celebrations going on. It was a really special year.
Yeah. It's still, and I get chills thinking about it, that there's this woman that wrote these things that long, that is still touching all of us.
Yeah, make me cry. Yeah.
In this very visceral, I mean, it is
active,
just so
active, engaged way.
Right.
That brings us together. And
her writing is still that, you know, still has that power. It's incredible.
I'm listening to her on the audio right now, Pride and Prejudice, and I'm just blown away by almost every sentence. I mean, it's just, you know, on many levels, not just the genius of the prose, but how she captures people is without par. And she had us all figured out. She had every possible personality type pinned down. She knew you, she got you right away. She knows how to convey that. And it's so alive. Her characters and her stories are so alive because they're us.
Can you imagine if she was alive today? If she was in modern.
Oh yeah, I think she'd scare the heck out of me. She's so brilliant, right? She's so smart, so incisive, like Henry James would.
Imagine that though.
Intimidating.
Well, one of the things though that I often wonder is, of course, there's absolutely no doubting Jane's genius at all, and as you said, the phenomenal active role she has in people's lives today. And no, it's not a sexist thing at all. There are lots of men that enjoy Jane Austen, and that, but if you just think about women for a second, you know, as I said, a woman for 200 years ago, the amount of women today that are still actively engaged is extraordinary. And it's difficult to think of anyone else actually that has that sort of, you know, not just writers. But one of the other things that I think probably makes Jane even more tantalizing is the fact that we actually know quite a little about her. The fact that we don't actually know what she looked like. We don't actually know, there's no diary. All we've got is her work and 60 or 70 letters that survived, but we know that the letters that survived that Cassandra didn't burn on her death, but let's just say them all bland ones, because I'm sure the ones that she got rid of were the ones that probably were, I don't know, teasing
cut out and burned.
Had stuff in. So I think because there is also actually quite a lot of mystery around her, I think that just gives it that extra layer of magic and you know, because you can't quite touch her, can you?
Right.
She's there in the work and she touches you so much in that, but you can't actually, none of us know Jane Austen, none of us do.
Right.
And actually, perhaps if she was alive today, of course, her writing would still be absolutely marvelous, but whether, you know, and phenomenal, but whether or not she'd still have quite the same, you know.
Interesting take on that. Yes, because there is that mystique that does keep you very interested, and just because you keep wanting to know. And it's always, you always want to know what you can't know.
Exactly. And she's sort of this character in the shadows, actually.
Right.
That is having this phenomenal effect and this genius that comes from, as I said, someone who's actually in the shadows that you just can't quite know.
Oh no, that's a really good, very good perspective on that, because if she was, she'd be on Twitter or something and we'd all
exactly. And would that, I said, it wouldn't obviously ruin her genius in terms of the work, but would that exactly take some of that mystique away from it? Oh yeah. Oh, very interesting. Okay. Natalie, you have to go on our Facebook page because there is so much love for you on the comment section from everybody from all over the place. They're so happy that you're here. And Bloomsbury Girls, buy the book, read it. I can't wait for the next one, because I think I was hearing, because I was distracted for a minute, but the next book kind of takes the same characters and you kind of expand on a few of them. Correct?
Yeah, it takes one of the three main women in Bloomsbury Girls that's new to everybody as of yesterday. It brings her forward 5 years, but there will be cameos by several other characters from the first two books, because I seem to have this world I've created that I don't want to leave.
Who wants to leave Rome? I mean, who wants to, who wants to, Caroline, thank you so much for joining us all the way from Melbourne.
Pleasure.
This was a beyond a treat having you here. Natalie, thank you for having her and for you being here as well. It's always wonderful seeing you. I got to meet Natalie before even this Jane Austen Society was published. So we've known Natalie for quite a few years here. So welcome back to Warwick. So thank you, everyone. Buy Natalie's book. Support Jane Austen Society Foundation. Good night, everyone.